My lords, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me the most enormous pleasure to be chairing this evening. I've known Claire ever since I chaired the Medical Ethics Committee at King's College, London, many years ago. And then I was chairman of the Advisory Council at St. Paul's, and Claire came and opened our institute. That institute was quite good, but it was not a patch on the institute here, of which I am happy to say I am a member of the Council of Reference. Rather odd title for being on an advisory panel. But Claire has created for the Abbey the most extraordinarily successful institute. She has been absolutely an inspiration, and I have watched it blossom under her, and it is absolutely wonderful. She has been the author, really, of a series of incredibly interesting lectures over the last 3 years. 5 years, goodness me. And they are all successful. And it is particularly interesting that she should choose to come and be our speaker tonight. I've had a preview of what she's going to say, and I think you'll find it utterly fascinating. Claire. Thank you.
My lords, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great privilege to be here. Last week, my esteemed colleague, Jamie Hawkey, cited a speech by Martin Luther King about the Good Samaritan. It was the Good Samaritan who acted justly because he responded to the immediate and real need of the one who had fallen among thieves on the road from Jericho to Jerusalem, while the priest and the Levite, who had passed by on the other side, were, in all probability, thought Martin Luther King, and not approvingly, on their way to a meeting of the Jericho Road Improvement Association. It falls to me tonight to make the case for the Jericho Road Improvement Association. And what a thankless, seemingly impossible task that is likely to be. From the story of the Good Samaritan onwards, we have regarded institutions with suspicion as instruments of dehumanizing policies, treating human beings as numbers, intent only on achieving targets that become ends in themselves, forgetting the human being at the heart of the original intention of the institution. The people who work at the Home Office are decent, well-meaning, moral people. Of that I have no doubt, said a solicitor who represents asylum seekers. But the Home Office, the institution, is my enemy. Speaking with great humanity at a seminar I attended recently, the solicitor showed how alive she was to the often heart-rending human reality of each asylum seeker's story, and she introduced us to one of her former clients who had managed to make a life for herself in the UK, contributing to the community and the economy, pleading for recognition of her humanity, not her status as one of millions of unwanted refugees who, to the Home Office, it seemed, were not really human. We are clearly to take the action of the Good Samaritan, not those of the passers-by, as our guide. To tend the suffering man's wounds, to take him to a place of rest and security, and to commit ourselves to funding his long-term care. That is how we should respond to our neighbours, friends and enemies alike. The response is unconditional. There is no careful calculation of how far finite resources might go, or attempt at sharing them out equally with all. The Good Samaritan cares wholeheartedly for the one who presents his need to him. By means of an unforgettable caricature, the character Mrs. Jellyby in Bleak House, Charles Dickens clearly imparts the warning of missing the need that is before us while attending to the great and grand injustices of the world. He introduces Mrs. Jellyby in a chapter appropriately entitled Telescopic Philanthropy. Mrs. Jellyby, declares her fervent supporter, Mr. Kenge, is a lady of very remarkable strength of character who devotes herself to the public. She has devoted herself to an extensive variety of public subjects at various times and is at present, until something else attracts her, devoted to the subject of Africa, with a view to the general cultivation of the coffee berry and the natives, and the happy settlement on the banks of the African rivers of our superabundant home population. Mrs. Jellyby's eyes, Dickens tells his readers, have a curious habit of seeming to look a long way off, as if they could see nothing nearer than Africa. Meanwhile, the children in the Jellyby household run amok. The servants are drunk, and Mr. Jellyby spends his time sitting in a corner with his head against the wall, as if he were subject to low spirits. He is, says Mr. Kenge, merged in the more shining qualities of his wife. I am not going to pass on the opportunity to observe that Dickens would hardly complain were the reverse to be the case, with Mrs. Jellyby merged in the shining qualities of her husband, whose philanthropy concentrated on far-flung fields, rather than the needs of his household. Dickens would, true to the context of his 19th century world, presumably have still blamed the neglect of home and family on Mrs. Jellyby and left Mr. Jellyby to his wider perspective. Setting aside misogyny, however, the point of the caricature is that such concern with public subjects, with justice in general, not only misses the injustice being perpetrated very particularly under one's nose, but also often misses the mark of what would be best to help others. Settle our superabundant population on the banks of African rivers indeed. There's a neat policy to Britain's alleged overcrowding. Mrs. Jellyby attends to abstract problems, which is what Africa is to her, while her far-seeing eyes cannot shorten their gaze to the real people and the real problems in her own home. Last autumn, at the symposium we held as part of our programme Embracing Global Challenges, Rory Stewart MP spoke of the phenomenal institutional and intellectual weight that was brought to bear on the challenge of Afghanistan over very many years, all to no lasting avail. He argued that rather than trying to organise theoretically rational responses to such problematic cases, we, all of humanity, not just governments and charities, should do what we can. Not what we think we ought to do, because we so often get that wrong, but what we can. His counsel was not a soft option based on observation from a distance. He had spent time in Afghanistan and been closely involved in attempts to manage or solve the situation, and this was his authoritative conclusion. Here are a couple of examples in other contexts of what Rory might have meant. After the 2004 tsunami that devastated the countries around the Indian Ocean, Peter Brown, a neighbour in the village where I used to live, who is pathologically distrustful of institutions, decided that something needed to be done. No large-scale charity or government department could be trusted to spend our donated monies well, he believed, so he got up a fund within our village of 200 souls and took it himself to a village of a similar size in Sri Lanka. Working with the locals, he provided immediate relief, then funded the rebuilding of their destroyed fishing boats, provided sewing machines for the women and musical instruments for the children. Until about 10 years ago, Salford was the worst suburb of Manchester, its high-rise blocks of flats drenched in the hopelessness of their residents. The local vicar fought to save his Victorian church from demolition, arguing that it was the only beautiful building left in the area. The vicar abandoned neither his church building nor the people of Salford, remaining for 30 years, thoroughly embedding himself in the community and finding endless ways of making things a bit better for the people among whom he lived. He prevented vandalism of his church and the theft of the lead on its roof by persuading the youths embarking on their rampage to become his choir. He sat down with the worst boy on the block and asked him, "Why are you so unhappy?" The boy said, "All this concrete." The vicar said, "Let's, you and I, dig a garden." And between them they did, surrounding the vicarage with green grass, flowers and shrubs. That boy, went on to become a landscape gardener and to play competitive rugby. Meanwhile, the caretaker of one of the aforesaid blocks of flats, called Pear Tree Court, which overlooked the vicarage, said to herself, "If the vicar can have a garden, I can have a pear tree orchard." Over time, through this caretaker's determination and the support of the vicar, the block went from being the worst in the area to the one with the longest waiting list. It planted its pear tree orchard, as well as a wild garden, and created a pond and a conservatory extended out from the front door so that the more senior residents could sit in comfort and watch the wildlife proliferate under their contented gaze. When the little local Salford flowering was brought to the attention of the bishop, he visited, and all our energies dropped as he tried to make sense of the success by reference to the formula it manifested. If he could get the formula clear in his head, then he could apply it to all the parishes in his diocese. It was a matter of institutionalizing the approach, because it wasn't fair that one parish flourished when others failed. It was a postcode lottery. And yet, his attempts to formalize the approach, which one could argue, and he certainly did argue, served justice, had the fairly instant effect of killing its inspiration. Thus might the bishop have thought if he had observed the actions of the Good Samaritan. What had the Good Samaritan done that was so right that could be multiplied out and offered with equal success to all the others who had fallen among thieves on the Jericho road? For if what he did could not be so multiplied, how was justice being served? And how could it be just that one tiny village of 200 souls in Sri Lanka got so much detailed and appropriate attention when the millions of others around the Indian Ocean did not? And yet, how could international agencies seeking to serve the needs of all, not just some, offer the kind of detailed, person-centered human support that Peter Brown offered? Making the case for the Jericho Road Improvement Association is not easy. Institutions do not elicit the energy, excitement, recognition, feeling of making a difference, expression of unconditional love that arise from the single-hearted response to the injustice being perpetrated under my compassionate eyes. Often the institution, the attempt to rationalize the way we act justly or care about each other, is the very means by which that care is denied or undermined. Often, it seems that institutions have their members serving not justice, but the institution itself. But, dear friends, justice cannot do without institutions. without denying the moral beauty and value of the individual heroic act of compassion, the individual cannot bring about justice on her own. A single act of compassionate service is a good and human act, and nothing should detract from its moral value. But we cannot allow the poor, the weak, the vulnerable, the dying to depend upon individual acts of goodwill alone. Here is a story of a modern-day Good Samaritan who saw the need for an institution. David Nott, with whom I had the privilege of sharing some airtime yesterday, has for decades now taken himself to the most dangerous areas of the world, where general and traumatic surgery is desperately needed because of conflict or natural disasters. David will perform life-saving surgery under terrifying conditions. He is by any account a hero. He had the knack, finding himself in a situation of overwhelming need, of attending fully to the patient under his hand and seeking to save that person's life, not worrying at that moment about the numerous others who were also dying from lack of surgical attention. In this way, his focus and energy were not dissipated, and the one under his surgeon's knife had the best chance possible of survival. He became only too aware of the failings of this approach. He was, of course, unable to tend everyone who was brought to him. More tellingly, and with admirable honesty and self-awareness, he acknowledged how he felt in himself the treacherous delight of the adrenaline rush, the feeling of being utterly needed, of his actions making the most enormous difference, of the power of saving even just one life, of being in the most dangerous situation imaginable. And he could see, though it didn't stop it happening, the danger of burnout through exhaustion and the psychological damage from the terrible scenes he witnessed, within which he enacted his life-saving work. He saw that he had not just to perform life-saving surgery himself, but to teach others how to do so. Very quickly, courses were established, and now the David Nott Foundation funds doctors from war-torn or natural disaster-laden regions to learn the essential skills for treating people in traumatic situations. David Nott, the modern embodiment of the Good Samaritan, will say that you have to go from the individual heroic act to the generalized, institutionalized application of the good you can do. Otherwise, justice is not served. David Nott's practical discovery is supported by, among others, academic lawyer Kok Chor Tan. Tan argues that justice can only be realized by institutions, never by individuals. Without just institutions setting the context for action, individuals cannot, on their own, know how to respond to injustice. By Tan's account, institutions are not merely instrumental in bringing about justice, they are constitutive of it. Through institutions, we understand what we are entitled to and what our responsibilities are. Just institutions remove the dependence of the vulnerable on the goodwill of the wealthy, and they relieve the individual of the burden of knowing he will never be able to serve everyone's needs. The creation of circuit judges by Henry II in the 12th century brought into being a just institution, which ensured that the law became the law of the land, the common law. The circuit judges were responsible for administering, across the realm, the law that was made in Westminster. Within a just legal system, the judge can attend to the case brought before her without, in that moment, having to worry about all the other cases. I mean live cases, not precedent. Her duty, assigned by the institution, is to administer justice here, now, in this court. Her energy and focus are not dissipated. Similarly, a physician is freed by the National Health Service from the paralysing awareness of the size and complexity of all the healthcare needs in the country. He can tend the patient before him wholeheartedly. A police officer can deal with the specific street crime to which he is called. A civil servant can attend to his bit of policy, and so on. And we can volunteer individual acts of self-sacrifice and service which come from deep altruistic motives to our heart's content, without worrying that the poor will suffer because my urge to help may not be sustainable. And we can recognize, with due humility, that our acts of compassion serve to maintain our own moral health, as well as benefiting others. Just institutions give a context to our individual service and locate it within a greater narrative of service. Just institutions are the means by which humans can work with each other, uniting our efforts, creating something which is greater than the sum of its parts, reducing the chance of actions clashing with each other or cancelling each other out. We have then a moral duty to ensure our institutions are just. Sometimes we have a moral duty to create new just institutions, as for example, the creation of the United Nations. I believe a new just institution is needed now to serve ecological justice. In the words of Mark Hudson, though the time is short, addressing the ecological crisis is a marathon, not a sprint. Human emotion runs out of steam. News headlines are voracious in their need for new subjects. They can't just keep shouting that we're all doomed. Activism has to reinvent itself again and again, and individuals, even growing collections of individuals, cannot keep doing this. There is so much to do, and every human being has a part to play. An institutional response is the best way to ensure the necessary efforts are demanded of us and sustained. The ecological cause is just and lasting, and it is scandalous that children are reduced to playing truant to make us see that. There can be tremendous excitement at the creation of a new institution. The cause it has been created to serve is at last being taken seriously. The new institution commands resources, strategy, channeled goodwill. There is a sense of direction and moral purpose. Above all, there is energy. It is tempting, then, to look at our apparently moribund, apparently no longer just, old institutions, the ones that cease to energize, that kill off inspiration, silence the spirit of compassion and humanity, serve themselves, not the cause they were created for, absorb money and attention, have become morally corroded, to look at them and decide to destroy them and start again. Our rubbish parliament, we think, taking up hours and hours and hours in failing to agree on a Brexit deal that no one wants. Our rubbish civil service, turning people into numbers and implementing policies that only work in theory. Our rubbish judiciary, the enemies of the people, ignoring the democratic mandate of a referendum. But these are lazy caricatures based upon misdirected anger. We are lucky to have a constitutional balance of power in the UK that, at its heart, serves justice through the democratic responsibility of the Member of Parliament, elected to represent local constituents, the civil servant bound by honesty, integrity, political impartiality, and objectivity, the judge by the rule of law. The institutions of the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary are, at heart, the custodians of justice, a vital component of a civilized society. But that does not mean that the institutions are anywhere near perfect servants of justice. It is not feasible to suggest that there will ever be a time when they are, just as we will never see moral perfection in ourselves. Rather, we might see them as being better or worse at responding to the call of justice. Imagine the institutions as boats sailing through the water. In the analogy, justice is the compass point setting the direction of travel. It is that towards which the institutions are journeying, that by which they are called. And as all good skippers know, you cannot fix your helm rigidly, but must constantly adjust it in response to the wind and the waves. Your skill is keeping the boat no more than 5 degrees either side of the compass point, even as it navigates its way through sometimes choppy waters and unfavourable winds. There are 3 threats to institutions' ability to sail in the direction of justice. First, they can set up systems which fail to serve the just purpose for which they were created, taking the boat right off course. Second, they can absorb more energy in being maintained themselves than the service they are intended to offer, endlessly polishing the brass fittings and scrubbing the deck. Third, they can become morally corroded and corrupted, with the crew deliberately jeopardizing the journey from motives of self-interest. The first threat, that institutional systems do not serve justice, even if the institution itself claims to, has been seen historically when, for example, the House of Commons represented only some of the population. Universal franchise is still under 100 years old. 150 years ago, the civil service was populated by means of patronage, not merit. 1,000 years ago, the law was not applied equally across the land. But even though those historic injustices have been removed, it does not mean that we can cease to keep watch. Today, politicians struggle to choose to whom to give their loyalty, to the majority in the EU referendum, to their constituents, to their parliamentary party, to their conscience. Civil servants wrestle with the challenge of avoiding postcode lotteries in health and education and housing and immigration while not turning people into numbers. Judges struggle with lack of resources and the consequent inequality of access to the courts. But the struggles are made within still venerable institutions, and they are, on the whole, towards justice, not away from it. Justice remains the navigation point. A lovely, possibly apocryphal story as an example of the second threat of the institution absorbing more energy than the justice it should be serving. When the Department for the Environment occupied the 3 tower blocks in Marsham Street, now demolished, there was a civil servant whose sole job was to assign offices as his colleagues' seniority changed, with his pencil allocating new offices, with his razor blade erasing old ones, all day, every day. Today, arguably, the opposite danger is the case, that not enough resource and support is given to those who tend the ecology of government, parliament and the judiciary, ensuring the chamber, department or court is running as it should be. The third threat of internal corrosion and corruption is always present. Virtuous institutions, that is, ones which have been created to further good causes, like justice, can be caught out if the assumption is made that since virtue is the goal of the institution, virtue will inevitably be its character. It was, I confess, a shock to arrive at the headquarters of the Church of England and find there all the human failings I had known in myself and my colleagues in the secular law school at King's College London. It was an even greater shock to find Oxfam employees exploiting women whilst ostensibly serving countries in great need. The MP's expenses scandal stayed in the headlines for weeks on end because it was shocking news that our elected representatives could fiddle the books in this way. And more recent allegations of bullying and sexual harassment are similarly shocking. Now, the presence of institutional anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are alleged. Institutions which serve good ends have to pay great attention to the ethos that prevails within them. Just because you are responsible for trying to ensure the citizens of the UK are, say, adequately housed, unquestionably a just cause, it does not mean that your personal receipts are beneath your notice, nor that you are no longer required to be courteous to your staff. And only writing the policies and only creating yet more oversight committees will not address moral corrosion. The heart of the people in the institution has to be engaged too. I have argued that we cannot have justice without just institutions, and I have suggested ways in which the justice of institutions can be threatened. Running like a thread through these matters is the presence of human agency. For although institutions undoubtedly take on lives of their own, they are what they are because of the people who work in them and the people for whom they were created. And this observation brings me back to the Good Samaritan. Those of you who are only too aware that we are in a sacred Christian place will be relieved to know that I am not going to conclude my lecture by suggesting that Jesus was wrong to champion the actions of the Good Samaritan, because the just act of one person is powerful. David Nott, our modern Good Samaritan, knew from a utilitarian perspective that his individual services as a surgeon in places of conflict were pretty futile. That did not stop him from going to those places, nor did it stop him from focusing on the person in front of him, doing everything he could to save that life. It was what he was called to do. The navigation point of justice for him drew him to this very particular direction. And his individual focus was supported by the Talmudic saying that whoever saves one life saves the whole world. And because he wasn't paralyzed by the size of the problem, as a utilitarian might have been, some lives were saved that would not otherwise have been. But there was another unmeasurable outcome to his precise and particular individual service, which made an enormous difference. Saving one life boosted the morale of the whole team and gave them all more courage and energy to continue to do what they could. Even if you think you are operating within an institution that was created to serve justice but isn't managing very well, either in the way it promotes overly utilitarian policies or in the institutionalized unjust attitudes of its staff, it is important that you yourself try to respond to the call of justice and model just behavior. You will be attractive to people of goodwill, and if the institution is dedicated to serving justice, as I believe our public service institutions still are, then your example will count. And the power of goodness itself will come and support you. I finish with this story told to me by a Hindu friend. A little bird found to her horror that the ocean had swept over her nest and taken her eggs. She stood on the seashore and cried to the waves, "Give them back! Give my eggs back!" The ocean ignored her. The waves ebbed and flowed. The water continued to cover and hold back her eggs. She cried and cried to no avail. But instead of giving up, determination grew in her. The fierce love of the mother refusing to surrender to the cruel sea. If the sea would not return her eggs, she would empty the sea. She flew up, dived down towards the water, and took a drop of the sea into her beak. She flew back to the shore and let the drop of seawater fall. Back she flew to the sea, took a drop of water in her beak, flew back to the land, and dropped the drop of water. Back to the sea, a drop of its water, back to the land, letting loose the drop. Back to the sea, back to the land, back and forth 100 times, 1,000 times. As night fell, weary, she continued her determination to empty the sea unabated. In the early morning, she was still flying back and forth, the single drops amounting to no more than a cupful, but still she worked. Finally, the god of the sea, who had been watching, could bear it no more. He went to her and said, "What are you trying to do?" "I'm emptying the ocean," she replied. "Why?" "Because the ocean has stolen my eggs and won't give them back." "But you will never empty the ocean." "Never?" "It will take you 1,000 years." "Then I will take 1,000 years, but I will not give up." The god took pity on her and commanded the ocean to return her eggs. Thank you very much.
Well, that was a splendidly spirited and critical analysis of our institutions. And having been part of two separate institutions, I'm thoroughly cowed, I think, as a result of that. But there will be, I'm sure, some questions. And who would like to start? Lady de Souza.
Claire, thank you so much. You talk about the necessity for justice to become institutionalized, okay? Or institutions to have justice. I wonder whether you could say something more about how institutions which have become time-honored and have fallen prey to all the three, the problems that you discussed.
How do they, thank you, how do they begin to renew themselves? Again, towards the end, you talked about the individual action and, the hero, David Nott. Okay, so someone like David Nott, who is trying to institutionalize what he is doing as a Good Samaritan by setting up the David Nott Foundation, there are inevitably problems with that. And to retain the individual Samaritan ethos within an institution, and in particular how to renew it, is something I don't even know where to begin to think about.
So the first thing to say is it doesn't happen by itself. It is something that has to be attended to really all the time. There are people within institutions who need to attend to it. One example comes to mind, Jonathan Evans, who, when he was head of MI5, decided that as Director General, he had time. And so what he did was to create a system with an ethics counsellor so that all the operatives had someone they could come and speak to absolutely in confidence about any concerns they might have. Because the operatives in MI5 are both the greatest strength and also the greatest danger of the operation. So that's what he did. Westminster, this is sort of what Westminster Abbey Institute's for the public service institutions. So we have, as well as these public lectures, we have seminars, private seminars for, we're going to have one with the judges. We had them with several different government departments and with parliamentarians, which are an opportunity to recalibrate, to reconnect with the vocation to public service. And my experience with the Institute has been that it doesn't take very long, because there is this vocation in people who work in these ways. It just gets forgotten, or it gets dusty or covered over with being too busy. So making the opportunity to reconnect, recalibrate is the most important the most important thing. There are always structural questions as well. You do have to attend to not spending too much time just supporting the institution, but reconnecting with what you're there for and what the institution is there for. Remembering that is how it is done, and it has to be done deliberately.
Yes, next question.
Thanks so much for your talk today. My question is, what can everyday people do to help ensure just institutions? What can all of us do today to strengthen our institutions and help them to become more just? Would one solution be better education, such as the Ethics Academy you had helped to found? What can all of us do?
Yes. So I'm tempted to quote Rory Stewart, do what you can. There'll be something that you're called to do. So I don't know what your area of work is, but there'll be something that you are called to do. But see it as connecting into us all working together. You're not the hero, the sole saviour of the world, but there'll be something that you are good at, that you love doing, that sets your belly on fire, that you can pursue. And I bet you it is something good. It's something that serves other people. It may set your belly on fire to make money for a bit, but we know from research that after a certain amount of money, and it's not very much, it's £30,000 a year or something, money has no relation to happiness at all. So it'll be sustained if it's something good. So connect in some way. Yes, of course, education is one of the ways. I recently had to have a procedure, and it was quite a painful procedure, and this beautiful doctor who looked about 16 was saying to me, he said, I always vote, he said, but I have just given up. I mean, who would I vote for? And I was saying to him, you have got to carry on voting. And then, this is really painful, but you've got to carry on voting. So, where you can, don't let us lose faith in these institutions. Don't let us be angry with the institutions. Let us be angry. Well, don't let us be angry. It's like drinking poison. See what can be done.
Can I just ask you, there are institutions among charities, particularly Oxfam and also Save the Children, and various other ones where there seems to be an absolute canker in the centre, where there were two things. There was the misbehaviour, yes, and there was the cover-up. I mean, that's true in the churches too. It is. But I'm particularly thinking at the moment of Oxfam and Save the Children. I mean, how does one approach that? And what should the public approach be to that? Should they stop, for instance, giving money to Oxfam?
Well, I do think it's a particular danger if you work for a virtuous institution. I mean, the thing that I noticed when I came to work for the Church of England was because what we were all basically working towards was the kingdom of God. And this was such a great vision. I found that there was some really, really bad behavior justified with that goal in mind. If I may just give you a brief lesson in moral philosophy, of course you must think about the goals of your actions of your institution, because that's why they're there. They're there to serve a purpose and an outcome. Of course you must think about them, and you must think about whether those goals are just. But you must also think about how you're going to achieve those goals and whether the action itself is morally acceptable or not. And it doesn't matter how great the goal is. If the action is harming people, involving lying, involving covering up, involving exploitation, the action is wrong. The goal does not justify bad behavior. I did this work very much in the context of medical research on humans, where great steps forward in medicine were being promised by the research, but if you don't design the research in such a way that the people, the subjects in the research are properly cared for, then the research is not ethical. Similarly, you should ask people if that's what they want, and I think some of these charities just can get very big for their boots, and I acknowledge Rory Stewart's concern that we think we know better. We think we know better. for other people, and we don't necessarily know better. And it's not paying attention to that basic moral health in yourself and in the institution you're serving, or the institution itself, that's how the canker can set in. And you can forget that you're serving something, or your institution is serving something. The institution itself is not the goal. Oxfam, we donate to Oxfam because Oxfam is serving a very important purpose. We don't donate to Oxfam to keep Oxfam going. Oxfam needs to remember that. Oxfam and the church should enact penitence for what it's done, publicly.
Yes, Claire.
Thank you very much for the compassionate talk that you've given. But my mind goes back to I, Daniel Blake, the film. And I just had a picture of the job centre,
Yes.
and the job centre worker,
Yes.
who had to turn away Daniel Blake and et al. And how possibly can your philosophy impact at that micro level? And we can talk today about the austerity that is affecting so many people, unseen. They're not here in these illustrious, great places. They're alone in small places with no power, with no speech, with no one to represent them.
Thank you. So part of an answer to that question is that the people on the front line should have delegated authority. So a police officer has the most extraordinary amount of power. Bobby on the beat has the power of arrest, turns up to a situation and has to actually analyse sometimes highly complex circumstances where there may be a history of mental illness, of abuse within a family, of drug, of alcohol. There may be problems with the neighbourhood. There's enough issues there to keep a moral philosopher busy for 10 years, and the police officer has to deal with all of that as one there. And the police officer is, Cressida, isn't he or she, empowered to act, knowing that, so you're not always going to get it right. You're going to get it as right as you can, but if you know that you have the confidence of your institution behind you and your leaders behind you, and they'll support you, then you're much more likely to make a wise decision. And it goes without saying that you come to that situation adequately trained. And the same, it seems to me, is true of all frontline staff, because they are the ones who have the human face-to-face encounter. The people in Whitehall don't have that. So, but I think this is better and better and better understood in Whitehall, actually, that the knowledge is at the place of meeting between the two human beings, not theoretically back here. It's an ongoing challenge to make, this is really what I'm saying, I'm not really solving it, to make a system which is just and equal across the country. And there's something numerical about that. But the actual knowledge of the need and seeing what the need is in the face-to-face encounter. So everything has to be done to empower that.
Gentleman over there.
Claire, Alan Rayner, I'd like to thank you for organising at St Paul's the two series, one for the youth and education, and the other on My Word is My Bond, because I'm a chartered accountant. So I congratulate you for that.
No, my successors have organised those, I can assure you. I don't run St Paul's Institute as well anymore.
In Luton, I walk around and ask everybody on the streets, what the problem is, because I ran a centre for 10 years in Bayswater, and it takes 5 to 10 years to get people off drugs and drink and everything and get them back into work. But what I agreed with the mayor was that he would sort out passports for these people on the streets so that they could get back into work. And he very kindly did that. And it has actually created a whole process now of all the organizations within the town working together to get these people back into work and to help them. And I suggest that maybe the mayors should be encouraged to do this kind of cycle of work. But my real question is this. I've been living the 4 world religions for 17 years from B. Griffiths, and I would love you to do a series, organize a series here on religious education, because we have 15% of our population are now different nationalities, etc. Maybe you could consider that.
We have interfaith colleagues. Westminster Abbey Institute was set up quite precisely to serve public servants of all faiths and no faith. So that's always been our intention and focus. Thank you. Thank you for your example as well.
I think a gentleman at the back there.
Thank you very much. I work for an organisation called the Countryside Alliance, which some people may think ethical, some people not. I'd like to ask a question about the link or potential link between democracy and just institutions. There's been a move over the last 5-6 years or so to introduce more democratically elected leaders, whether it's police and crime commissioners, elected local mayors. Do you think that that level of democracy aids an institution, particularly with sort of one eye to the people who are outside protesting about the European Union, our membership of that, and perhaps that institution not having as strong a democratic link to these shores, whether that's in part created some of the resentment we see now? I'd be grateful for your thoughts on that.
Democracy is a volatile beast. It's so important, democracy, that it needs care and support. If you are democratically elected, you have to attend to power, because it's power that is given to you. That's the mandate that's given to you if you're voted for, if you're elected. And that, in and of itself, is morally corrosive. That walking alongside you as you try to make the world a better place, and most politicians step up to become politicians in order to make the world a better place, walking alongside that is the need to attend to power, to be selected, elected, and re-elected. So this is a volatile beast, democracy. And what I really like about the British Constitution is that the final decision is made by democratically elected representatives, the members of Parliament in the House of Commons, but they are supported by a politically impartial civil service, an independent judiciary, and dare I say it, some fairly intelligent contributions from the House of Lords. Because of the volatility of that delicate heart, for it to be protected is essential. So if you're going to have a democratically elected leader, one needs to be aware of what it is asking that person to be or to become, because they will have to pay attention to power, and that is in itself morally corrosive. Now, it might be that it's appropriate, or it might not be. It depends on the case in point. Every citizen in the UK over the age of 18 should feel connected to somebody who represents them in Parliament, because they do have everybody has an MP. They should feel that. I haven't met an MP yet who doesn't feel almost a sacred responsibility for their constituents. Whatever we might say lazily about MPs, that they're all in it for themselves, or they've got their noses in the trough, or it really isn't the reality as far as I can see. But they have to pay attention to power, and we shouldn't beat them up for that. It's part of the role. So it may or may not be appropriate to make different roles in leadership democratically elected.
And the lady here.
Hello. I just wondered if you had any thoughts on whether the institutions, which are our state schools, which are in a huge state of flux, are not looking at themselves and what their mission should be. Everything, I believe, should be getting the very best from every child. So back to your example of Manchester, where the concrete was surrounded probably by poor, uninspiring schools. What can we do to make the institutions look at the children and the teachers who care about the children and put that first, rather than games and obfuscation? They've all passed Swahili. Well, great. There's not a lot of demand for it in the UK. Do you get where I'm coming from? So I wonder what your thoughts are, please.
So let me be clear. Westminster Abbey Institute does not comment on government policy or tell the government how to do its job.
No.
Let's be clear about that. I refer to my earlier comment about the knowledge and the wisdom arising in the face-to-face encounter. So here we have teachers encountering pupils. That's where the knowledge and understanding and information is. So everything that empowers the teachers to do that job well should be done, it seems to me. And teachers run into difficulty when they have to meet targets. This is it's difficult. So you want to make sure it's not a postcode lottery of schools. So how do you make sure that all the schools are of an equal-ish standard? Well, measure them. How do you measure them? Tests. It's a way of coming at a good intention, which is justice, or just an equal access to good education. But I think we know that that's not really all the answer at all, and things which disempower teachers are not really the answer.
We've got, I think, 2 people over here, and then that will be the end. I can see a hand up.
Thank you so much, Claire, for really positive, inspirational talk, as ever. I really agree with you that there's something of a compositional fallacy in thinking that the members of the institution equal the institution. But you touched upon this idea of policy, and you alluded to the slightly utilitarian flavour of most policies, and to my mind that is generally opposed to the principles of justice. And I wonder how far you think perhaps that justice is impossible within our institutions until we return to a more Kantian approach to policy.
A more Kantian approach, that we follow the categorical imperative. We attend to our duty rather than to outcomes. Yes, I think we've been rather nervous about this. So I get asked quite often, why are we so afraid of the word moral? And, you can't use the word moral, Claire, because no one will come, they'll be embarrassed. And MPs say, we can't come to anything with ethics in the title, because we think we don't know the difference between right and wrong and we have to be taught it. Or I'm somehow getting onto some moral high ground and I'll be pulled down from it. Inevitably, somebody in my past, in my family, will have done something 30 years ago, and down I'll come. So I think this is a time actually now for championing duty-based morality more. It's gone out of fashion, and we've lost our self-confidence almost in having a sense in ourselves of what our duty is and where it lies. And utilitarianism is a very convenient way of coming to an answer. It's mathematical. You say everybody counts as one. More people happy than sad, action good. More people sad than happy, action bad, job done. There's no tragedy in utilitarianism. You always know what the answer is. But as we know, and as people have attested, people are not numbers. and it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. So that has been counterbalanced by a right-based morality where we thought, well, okay, we know that people aren't just numbers. So what we have to do is we have to check whether people want this to happen. So we'll do a consultation on this policy and see if the stakeholders want it or not. And some of you probably will have been involved in things like that. So you get a sense of whether people want it or not. But at no point is anyone asking really the question, is this right? Is this the right thing to do? And I think we have to start asking that question again and not being afraid, not thinking that the answer is ever going to be absolute. But I sometimes talk about what we do is moral Pilates. We need to exercise our moral muscle. So come the day when you have to make a morally courageous decision, you're ready because your muscle is exercised.
I think one more person who had a hand up.
She's there.
Right. And then that's the last one.
Right. Last question.
Thanks very much. Building on that point about exercising our moral muscles, I want to ask about the tension between what an individual might conceive of as justice versus the corporate position on that. So it's kind of stating the obvious. I work in the Department for International Development, and occasionally it's a very vocational department, but occasionally there are tensions between what individual civil servants think is the right thing to do versus the corporate position. So I just wanted maybe some practical advice actually on what leaders should do to stimulate a debate about challenging, maybe speaking some truth to power, but also working out for an individual how to sort of sit with their conscience and do the job that the corporate body is saying we've got to do.
Yes. I think, so this is the challenge of anybody within any institution, is managing that relationship. So I would say beware moral certainty. Beware the thought that you and you alone know what is right and everybody else has got it wrong. You may be right. That may be the case, but just beware if you're absolutely certain, because probably there's something you haven't thought of. Reality, the world is a messy place, as Diffid would know better than most. It's a messy place, and we are doing the best we can. And the glory, if you like, and the challenge and the pain of working with other people is that you have to compromise. It'd be easy if you were on your own, just making your own decisions, and nobody else was affected and nobody else had a view, but it's not the case. And a good institution will find a way of holding that and moving forward nevertheless. So voting is one way. And if you have a good, just system of voting, when people believe in the system, then you accept if you lose the vote. Votes mean votes, and we have raised voices, not raised fists, to quote Peter Hennessy, at the moment in the UK. That's one way of doing it, but that often with moral decisions, a vote isn't the way. It's not binary. You know, you need. Everybody needs help in thinking through an issue, and if you're in a context where you can have a proper discussion and explore without fear of being thought to be stupid or have the wrong view or be against the corporate view. And that is for leaders to create the atmosphere within which it's possible to have that kind of learning conversation. Everybody recognizing that we work this out together, and not everybody is going to be happy all the time. But this is a bit of a contemporary fallacy, I think. You say to somebody, well, what do you think? Let me take your view. I know for me, my view is always changing, and I want help in working out what the right thing to do is. I'm not just somebody with a view, which I take, which is either ignored or accepted. It's much more interesting than that, and nuanced and compromising.
Claire, thank you very much, not only for the excellent lecture, but particularly for the deeply honest answers to the most really very difficult questions that have been asked. And we're very grateful to you for, in a sense, bearing your soul. And it was wonderful. Thank you very much indeed.